Thank you, Itaya, and thank you for the invitation to join this this forum. It's a very exciting project. This run for this is its final maturation in this exhibition and symposium, and I want to congratulate the Bard and Itaya for seeing this to fruition. I think it's an important contribution to the field. I'm honoured to represent an Asian perspective. It's the only voice I was invited to speak about votive objects in an Asian setting. I said that's singularly impossible. Let me deal with South Asia alone. And with a little arm twisting, I was persuaded to look at South Asia in a slightly broader setting. So my contribution has been votives and votive objects in the greater South Asian setting in the Indian subcontinent, and through the medium particularly of Buddhism and its prophetizing and widely dispersed diaspora into East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So I want to present here a perspective on the early emergence of protective deities in the Indian subcontinent, largely related to early nature spirit cults, some of which manifest into later deities we recognize from the Brahmanical pantheon of Hinduism as we know it today. We'll also look at the materiality of the Buddha's life in the 5th century BC, the authority of the Buddha's teachings, and the way in which that in itself embodies enormous religious authority and gave rise to a cult of relics associated both with the corporeal remains of the Buddha and through a hierarchy of relics, the associated objects worthy of veneration in memorial of the Buddha and his teachings. Central to this, of course, is the role of in the Buddha's setting of the stupa, pre-Buddhist funerary tumuli adapted for Buddhist use within the Buddha's lifetime. In fact, the Buddha spoke in his final sermons, which come down to us in some early texts, of the manner in which his corporeal remains post-cremation should be preserved and placed in a series of funerary mounds, which became memorialized as the stupas that we know from the Indian landscape. The term stupa itself is first referred to as Dagaba in the earliest inscriptions. Dagaba Gata essentially means relic chamber, variation, so that's the worship receptacle and so on, embodying the same concept. Some of the very earliest objects that are venerated in India require no material means on the part of the donor. You don't have to be wealthy. Most of the earliest objects, and this is a tradition which begins with the very earliest surviving material objects of worship we have from India. The earliest sculptural remains are in hand-modeled or molded clay. This continues right through into later medieval, indeed down into modern times, as we saw in that image on the screen from Itaya of the making of clay stupa votives by Tibetan practitioners today. So this is a continuous process. The humblest of materials can be used by petitioners. What we do see is the concentration of location archaeologically of many of these small clay moldings, these clay impressions made from fired clay or metal cast molds in particular locations. And this, of course, signals the importance of the landscape, the sacred landscape in India, the sacred geography, which is defined by mythological events, by the movement of divinities across the landscape, which are recorded particularly in the early Brahmanical literature, in the Vedas and in the Puranas, the commentaries on the great epics, which speak of the gods traveling the landscape, placing their feet in certain locations, and the significance of the residual footprint, the pada, becomes a key signature for sacredness in the landscape. Others are defined by in the Buddha's setting, by the life of the Buddha, the places he visited in his lifetime, the places in which the key events were performed, the 4 great events of the Buddha's life, from his birth to his enlightenment, his first sermon, and his passing to Nirvana, Mahaparinirvana, the four key events. These themselves were marked from the very beginnings, from the moment of the Buddha's death, in fact, by memorials, stupas, and commemorative pillars carrying inscriptions. So this landscape was already being defined as a sacred geography across India in the early centuries BC, this process which continued and had other layers built upon it. I show on the screen this extraordinary image on the left, a molded clay votive from what we know was the ancient port city of Bengal, from whence international traders journeyed east, including as far as South China in the early centuries AD. It's an image of a goddess for whom we have no information. We don't know her name. We have no idea of her precise function. We don't know the motivation of the donor. We can only speculate on all those sets of questions. But we do know that she has later incarnations, that the memory of this deity, whoever she may be, continues on into later Hinduism. We recognize her by her boon-giving gestures, dispensing of blessings and material benefit to donors, a Lakshmi-type figure, a dispenser of bountiful gifts, much celebrated in India throughout the entire history of Hinduism today, as much as it was 2,000 years ago. She also has another feature which is exceptional, and that is the treatment of the headdress. If we look at the detail here, you'll notice that the adornment of the so-called hairpins that decorate her hair are in fact auspicious emblems. These are askamangalas, these are sacred and auspicious motifs, many of which look rather weapon-like. And if we look at an extraordinary small bronze, which is less than 1.5 inches in height on the right-hand screen, likely dating from around the 2nd century BC, which makes it one of the very earliest metal objects we have surviving from the subcontinent of a figurative representation of a deity, it's made very explicit that the hairpins, so to speak, are indeed weapons. And the displaying of weapons in the hair in this manner is clearly a concept which we don't recognize in its earliest phase. We don't know how to explain it, but we do know that it has the memory of that passes down into later Hinduism, and we see it in the goddess Durga, who is lent the weapons of all the male gods to deal with the troublesome demon that none of the males can deal with, but Durga, armed with the weapons of the 5 great male gods, then slays the demon Mahisha. Mahishasuyamardini is the subject. It's one of the most popular forms of the goddess Parvati, the wife of Shiva, in her extreme wrathful manifestation. There's a continuum from the benign to the wrathful. The marking of sacred spaces can take many forms, and often it's, we all know when you talk to a person of South Asian origin and talk about going on pilgrimage, it's almost a euphemism for travel in general. Travel is almost indistinguishable from pilgrimage. You travel and you experience places. I boarded a flight 2 weeks ago from Delhi to Hyderabad, packed to the gonwales with people who didn't get off the plane when I did in Hyderabad. It was just an unimportant stop on the way to Tirupati, which is a nowhere place. It's tiniest, it's just a village. Well, it's got infrastructure now because it receives 10 to 20,000 visitors a day who come expressly. There's no other reason for going but to visit the great Vishnu temple. And it's the wealthiest single religious institution in India. It's in the most remote region of southern Andhra Pradesh. No other reason to go there except on pilgrimage. This represents a scene here where one of the most holy places in the Hindu world is at Allahabad, which is marked by the junction of 3 sacred rivers, by the Ganges, the Ganga, by the Yamuna, and by the now lost, mythical, but almost certainly once was, river, the Saraswati River. Where these 3 rivers meet is regarded as one of the most potent places in the Shiva world. The devotees of Shiva, devotees assemble on a cyclical calendar every 12 years for this celebration. Shiva Linga are made in sand inherently temporary structures which will, with the movement of the water, will wash away in no time. This assembly of devotees at Allahabad, the Kumbhamela, many of you have heard of it, is the single largest religious gathering on earth. At its height, the last celebration was 2012, and I think if you Google it, the figures are 7 to 8 million people attended that event. At any single day, there were between 1 and 2 million people over a 10-day festival. At the climactic final day, there were something like 5 or 6 million people. Unbelievable numbers of people, all of whom immersed themselves in the waters of the sacred rivers, taking blessings, cleansing by bathing in a holy place is regarded as one of the most auspicious activities you can undertake as a Hindu devotee in India. This is not the Kumbhamela on the screen. This image represents a temple tank. All Hindu temples must have a tank for cleansing, purification, and this is a very large tank in South India at Kumbhakonan, a photograph taken around 1900, in which this tank is understood to provide a surrogate location for the river Ganges in northern India and to contain the waters of all the holy rivers of India. So it's believed, and devotees come again on this 12-year cycle to bathe and immerse themselves in this holy water. I mentioned footprints and the importance of the footprint. Many of you have heard of the Buddha Pada, the footprint of the Buddha being a very important way of representing the Buddha's presence if he wasn't represented in human form. This is again a shared cultural phenomenon in India. The footprint is regarded as a key way of representing divinity and can take many forms. It's an important part of Hinduism as it is indeed of Buddhism. We have in the Met this beautiful lapis little ring seal on the upper screen, pair of footprints, an inscription which indicates, which would venerate the part of the footprint whilst meditating on the deity. But we have no secure way of knowing which deity it is. The assumption has always been, and indeed our museum records still say, it's a Buddha Pada, represents the Buddha. There is nothing to indicate that. I need to change the records. It could be a Shiva Pada, it could represent Vishnu. We have no contextual information to unlock this. The inscription is not specific enough to allow us to be precise about that. The one on the lower right, a Hindu Shahi piece from Afghanistan, the late great Hindu kingdom before the coming of Islam to Afghanistan, clearly devoted to Vishnu. It has the attributes of Vishnu, the conch shell and the club associated with it. Now, I mentioned the great locations in the life of the Buddha's lifetime in particular. These were being celebrated from the time of the Buddha onwards. On the left-hand screen is an extraordinary photograph that survives from the 6th century murals from Central Asia, from Kaisel. These were collected by Lecoq and ended up in Berlin Museum. This was destroyed in World War II. What it shows are the 4 great locations of the Buddha's life. Lower left, his birth. Upper left, his enlightenment. Lower right, his first sermon. Upper right, his mortal passing, the 4 key events. And these were always immortalized. Portable shrines were used, we know from early centuries, to be both taken in procession, but also they seem to have a dual function. We have these early depictions of small portable shrines used in a Buddhist setting by devotees, clearly a royal donor figure here. But if you look at ethnographic photographs of 19th and 20th century Himalayan world, in which we see merchants, peddlers, traders, traveling through the Himalayan region, going about their business of trading goods, they will wear a gao, a metal container, a sacred box in which you will carry an image and maybe some printed prayers and so on, and that will have a talismanic function. So both things happen. These are both honoring the Buddha, but also seeking protection from the Buddha. One of the holiest places I mentioned was, of all the pilgrimage, and this remains true today, is the site of the Buddha's awakening, his so-called enlightenment, which happened at Bodh Gaya in northern India, beneath tree which was called the Bodhi tree, the wisdom tree. The direct descendant of that tree still stands today. It's the oldest documented tree in human history, going back 2,500 years. And has been replanted and replanted from saplings and so on. So genetically speaking, the oldest tree that we know. It is the single most important focal point for Buddhist devotees today. These photos were taken within the last year, and has been the case, and we have the first-hand descriptions provided by the Chinese pilgrims going to India, starting with Hsian, beginning of the 5th century, others in the 6th and 7th century AD, which give first-hand descriptions of the experience of standing at the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, and how moving, emotionally powerful and potent that was. Pilgrims were encouraged then to take away with them objects from pilgrim souvenirs, if you like. I hesitate to use that word, but objects which could be used for surrogate worship at a later date at another place. We have a small model in the exhibition that's come from the Met, which is a replica, a 12th century miniature model of the Mahabodhi temple, which you see a glimpse here. That model, in fact, looks remarkably like the modern restoration of the Mahabodhi temple, and there's a very good reason for that, because when Alexander Cunningham in the 1860s, the first founding director of the Archaeological Survey of India, had the monumental task of restoring the ruined Mahabodhi temple, he used these 12th century models as his guide. So we see it today as it was in its 12th century incarnation. The building, I'm sure, went through many different variant forms through its history. What we have is a time capsule of the 12th century. Stupas. This is essentially what they look like. We know that 8 great stupas were built at the time of the Buddha's passing, and under the great Emperor Ashoka, the 3rd century famous convert to Buddhism, the first ruler to institute Buddhism as state religion in India, took the relics from the 8 established stupas across his terrain. We know he controlled all the territory in which they were dispersed. The location of the stupas is our best indication of the territorial reach of the Mauryan Empire that he established. And those locations, he then divided the relics. And this is well documented pictorially in iconographic programs and textually. They were subdivided, and this was part of the propagation. Buddhism is really the most proselytizing of all South Asian religions, and spread widely. And the texts actively advocate that one of the ways to earn merit is to commission the building of a stupa in a place where there isn't one yet established, always extending the boundaries of the Buddhist diaspora. And of course, it spread wildly across all of Asia and including East Asia. We know a little bit of what it must have looked like at the time at these sites. This is from a small piece of graffiti from Parvati in Andhra Pradesh in central southern India, and it shows us the 2 key elements that are essential for a Buddhist monastery. One, of course, is the stupa, which you would visit daily and take the circumambulation of the stupa, pradakshina, inside the enclosure railings, and some of these railings provide the best iconographic and sculptural programs that survive from early India, from Bahut and Sanchi, 2nd, 1st centuries BC. The upper structure of the stupas in the later phases were decorated with narrative programs of the life of the Buddha and of his previous lives, previous incarnations of former bodhisattvas, the so-called Jataka stories, festooned with banners, sorts of decorations, and then adjacent the sacred tree. And the tree symbolism, of course, is a very ancient one and ties right directly back into nature spirit cults in India, pre-Buddhist ones, absorbed into the Buddhist system. we do have some idea. When Alexander Cunningham restored the Mahabodhi in the 1860s to look like those 12th century models, he wasn't aware of this clay molding, which we date to around the 6th century, which is almost certainly a depiction of the Mahabodhi shrine house and accompanying monastery complex. And we have Farsian's description from around 410 AD, which correlates almost exactly. You follow his text word for word. There is essentially what we see here, the location of the gates, the enclosure wall, the location of the river on one elevation, and so on. It's all contained and reflected. So we can reasonably, very compellingly, although this is uninscribed, suggest this is what the shrine house must have looked like at the Mahabodhi temple that in around 500 AD. This is how it looked in the 12th century. This is the model we have in the exhibition and of the type that Cunningham used for the restoration. The ones he employed are now in the British Museum. We know that these traveled very widely. Here's a photograph taken in 1936 by an Indian scholar traveling in Tibet. It's a wooden model of not just the principal image house of the Buddha, but of the entire complex, all in wood. And essentially functioning as a mandala. You would meditate on that. And this is a Nuttrung monastery, which was destroyed in the 1950s, and that object is entirely untraceable. At a certain point around in the late first millennium, the 4 sacred sites of Buddhism were expanded to 8. What they essentially did was then honored the 4 additional great events which took place in the Buddha's life, which celebrated the performance of miracles. The first 4 are factual events in his life. The second 4 are miracles that he performed in order to either convince doubters or to bring healing and so on. And so the 8 great locations became the new mantra. It was codified iconographically in this great sculpture, 2-meter high, image in not far from Bodh Gaya. The 8 great events are located, and then numerous miniature ones were created, which were dispersed throughout the Buddhist diaspora. One of the key elements in early Buddhist worship, which persists from the very beginning, is the veneration of relics. The corporeal remains of the Buddha, those of his disciples, and so on. And we see the very earliest depictions from 100 BC at Bahut, astride the elephant, the relic container being paraded, displayed for veneration in this wonderful container. And we know what the containers look like. We have a handful surviving from 2nd century and 6th century, respectively. And we also know that relics are essentially are concealed rather than revealed. They're placed within the womb chamber of the stupa. They're not intended. They're understood to be present. It's not necessary to visually see them. However, we do know that on occasions they were celebrated by display, paraded, and so on. And here is a clear depiction of the display of the relic container outside the stupa itself. Again, we have Farsian's 5th century description of the parading of the relic of the tooth of the Buddha, which is contained on that palanquin on the elephant here. It can in Sri Lanka in the early 5th century. Here is the same relic being celebrated at the end of the 19th century in Sri Lanka and Kandy. Relics necessitate relic containers and reliquaries, and we have a number of very important ones in the Met. The 2 I show you are both inscribed and are linked to specific, important figures who are otherwise unknown from the Swat Valley region of Pakistan in the first decade of our period. Cunningham also excavated near Sanchi, the other great Buddha stupa site, retrieved a series of remarkable reliquaries, rock crystal being the most important ones, material prized for its translucency and purity, linking it directly to the Buddha. This 8-location philosophy generated a whole series of a new genre of image making. I commented on these earlier. In the Buddhist setting, to show you on the right-hand screen a bronze mold for making the stupa what we call stupika, the little clay three-dimensional stupas. This bronze mold, almost certainly of Indian manufacture, was recovered from a shipwreck in the Java Sea, dated to the mid-10th century, only within the last decade, not yet published. It's remarkable. Clearly, these objects were circulating around the Buddhist diaspora very, very widely. Merchants tell us this. The stele on the right is one of two from the 5th or 6th century from Malaysia, which were left by Indian merchants operating in the region, one of whom was named in the inscription as a sea captain, a great sea captain, act of thanksgiving for safe passage. And we know that a cult associated with Avalokiteshvara, one of the great bodhisattvas, specifically focused on the 10 great perils, which included snakebite, illness, of course, and one of the 10 great perils was the dangers of sea travel. And Buddhists were principally a merchant community, and of course sea travel was a key part of that activity. The final thing I want to touch on, pressure of time, is the cult of the book, which is also a key element of Buddhist practice. And in this later period, we're talking now the 8th, 10th century, where we see the development of the Mahayana and indeed the Vajrayana sub-school which grows out of the Mahayana tradition. We see the veneration of the book as a cultic relic object in its own right. And we find a quantum shift from the celebration of the materiality of the relic to the celebration of the word of the Buddha. The Dharma, the teaching itself, becomes the object of veneration. And I think perhaps I'm getting signals to stop there. Thank you very much.